Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the founder of Black Hat, Jeff Moss.
Try the mobile microphone here because I like to walk around a little bit. Welcome to Black Hat 2017. We started this conference in Amsterdam in 2000, which seems like it's a lifetime ago, isn't it? Like how much has changed since then? But how much has not changed? So I want to tell you just a little bit about the idea behind Black Hat. I want you to get out of this conference basically what you put into it. I want you to ask questions. I want you to turn off your phone ringers. I want you to think about practically where the security meets the road. We try to be different than other security conferences and that not so much academic. We want it to be more practical. We want you guys to see something on the screen and then be able to go and do it when you get home, back at your company, immediately start playing with some new tech, trying out some new techniques. So much more applied. And this year, it's the largest ever we've done in Europe. Most number of sessions, most number of Arsenal sessions downstairs. So it's the largest all around. And once we reach a certain critical size, it allows us to do other things like have more sessions, invite different types of keynotes, have different size parties. So let's go through some housekeeping and then we'll start this off with some thoughts and then I'll introduce our first keynote speaker. To try to bring fresh blood into the security community at this level, in not an inexpensive conference, we're always trying to think of new ways to get people involved. And something that was developed a few years ago was what we called scholarship program. So for each conference, we ask people who haven't attended before, write us a white paper, write us something interesting. And we review it. It gets reviewed by the review board and other people inside Black Hat. And if it gets enough votes, you're accepted. And by being accepted, you get to attend free. So these are a lot of students and people who wouldn't normally have the financial means to attend because they don't work for a big company, but they're interested and passionate about the subject. So for this conference, 123 scholarships were given away. So if you're in the audience and you're here on a scholarship, let's see you raise your hand and give these people a round of applause. Okay, so now that you know who they are, feel free to talk to them. They're really interested in this subject and they want to get involved. And it's always fascinating to learn from people what got them involved. Are they coming from a different discipline? Because something we're seeing now is the multidisciplinary nature of security. I mean, I'm really fascinated by incentives and economics and how that impacts security. Maybe they're interested from a biological standpoint or an engineering standpoint. So take some time, get to know your fellow attendee. Also, we have people from 71 different countries, which I believe is almost a record for Europe as well. 16 of those countries only have a single person attending. And I like to sometimes run through the single person countries just because the security industries there are not very robust, and so they got motivated enough to travel here to be with us today. And so if you do run into somebody from one of these countries, congratulate them on making the journey. We have one from Afghanistan, Albania, Algeria, Bahrain, Colombia, Croatia, Honduras, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Kuwait, Latvia, Macedonia, New Zealand, Slovakia, Uruguay, and we found a database error because it lists one person is here from Reunion. Is that a country? No, it's part of France, but there is a Reunion Island. It snuck into the database, so we'll have to fix that. It reminds me of one time at Black Hat, we had the big meltdown on credit card processing. When people would register online, we'd process their credit cards, and then our credit card processor said, you know, there's a problem. We've run the batch 3 times, but the cards aren't going through. It's like, well, what do you mean? Just then, all the phones start ringing. People's credit cards have been charged 3 times. And so now their cards have so many holds on them, they can't check into hotels, and it's chaos. Somebody from Germany put an umlaut into the field and the credit card processor didn't filter inputs, and it crashed the whole batch, not before processing everybody ahead, but never marking the batch as bad. So I'm thinking reunion is probably not that severe, but we're going to look into it anyway, just in case. So also another thing I like to do with Black Hat is we have two keynotes. We have a keynote today, and we have a keynote tomorrow, same time, same place. And what I try to do with keynotes is expose you to thinking or ideas or perspectives you don't normally come across. If your head's down in the cloud, you might not get to talk to or hear or question people that you might hear at our keynotes. And that's by design. It might not be terribly practical to you, but it's important for you to be exposed to different ways of thought and see a bigger picture. So maybe you can understand what you're doing and how it fits in to a larger sort of architecture of the internet and of governance. So today is mostly a political global view with Christopher Painter, who was the first cyber coordinator at the United States State Department. And then tomorrow is Joanna Rakowska, thinking about and talking about how do you operate, how do you build systems in a world where you can't actually trust any software. It's sort of this concept of how do you operate in compromised environments. It's like a conundrum. So two different views. Christopher will be first and Joanna tomorrow. Okay, before we get started, I just want to see by a show of hands who here thinks that overall system complexity is increasing and will continue to increase in the foreseeable future. More complex systems from here until eternity? Okay, show of hands, same or less complexity? I would love to talk to you and understand what I'm missing. Okay, interdependence on third parties. Not just complexity, but we're actually more and more dependent on other parties we don't control and we don't have visibility in. Okay, show of hands. More dependence, more interdependence. Okay, same or less dependence? Okay, there's only one guy to talk to now. I'm up to 3 people, or maybe 4. Okay, and what I'm seeing as a trend is sort of an increasing security fragility. And I don't like this, but I don't really see a way around it. And what I mean by security fragility is when I was at ICANN and DNSSEC started getting more and more deployed, and the new GTLD program, we were mandating DNSSEC in all the routes of the new GTLDs, there was a lot of work around DNSSEC security and how it would fail, or could fail. And there's a lot of work around secure BGP. Resource PKI structures, even HPKP for websites. There's been some really fantastic failures there. What we do is we identify a problem, we engineer a solution, and the solution potentially makes the whole ecosystem more fragile. But as engineers, we've decided that it's worth the trade-off. We're making these risk trade-offs, and we've decided fragility for security. And we do this without talking to anybody in government or politics or our business or civil society, or we do it as engineers on engineering systems, on systems we're involved with. And we don't realize that this has implications to everybody on the planet. But they're not in the room, and they're not making the security trade-off, right? That's us. So we are going to be more and more involved, I believe, in making these sort of global decisions that are going to impact and maybe frustrate people in governments around the world. And finally, this is leading to awareness, I think, in governments and in businesses. Who here, another final show of hands, who here finds themselves now talking to senior management, executives, or the board more often than they ever thought they would have in their career? I mean, I know I am. I'm involved more than I've ever been, and it's surprising. And so I think what's happening is we're going to be called on more to explain these matters to boards and businesses. And so some of us will have to develop the skill to make that translation. Because if we screw it up, we're not going to be listened to. And then it doesn't matter how technically superior we are, if we can't make the case or we can't win the argument, then the overall system What we're working toward building will fail because of a communication issue, not because of a technology issue. And so this leads me to think that a lot of our future problems are going to be, they're global in nature right now. Transnational crime, foreign nation states, these are global problems. And so I'm thinking they're probably global solutions. You're probably not going to be able to solve any of these problems locally. You're probably going to have to be global in nature. And when I think global, I think giant mega corporations, and I think governments are probably, and I think, IETF, IAB, ICANN, I think of some other global bodies. There's not a whole lot of levers to pull in this arena for us as individuals. So what I do is I encourage you, do get involved in the bodies where you can make a difference, because there's just not enough of us in these forums. And so Chris and I are on a forum called the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace. It's not just a government body, it's a civil society body. We have a research group where we have hundreds and hundreds of people that can contribute research to inform our discussions. And I think that's going to be the future. So that's why I invited Chris to speak today. I want us to hear from somebody who has spent their career looking at this problem from the government's perspective, not from the technical perspective, because the two have been meeting for the last couple of years, and it's only going to get more intense. Chris started his career, long time federal prosecutor. I first heard of Chris as he famously was the person to prosecute Kevin Mitnick. Later on, he became the first he helped draft the United States strategy for cyberspace, and then went over to the State Department to be the first cyber coordinator. And then I interacted with him when I was at ICANN, and then now at GCSC. So it's really my honor to introduce Chris, and he's going to give you a perspective on a global nature of these cyber problems. With that, hey Chris, come on up. Yeah? Chris is going to be taking questions at the end, so if you hear something you want to challenge him on or ask him about, just take a note, and about probably, half an hour in or so, we'll start doing questions. And somebody will be running around with a microphone. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Jeff, and it's great to be at Black Hat and in London again. I love coming to London, so it's great to be here. As Jeff said, I've had a long career dealing with this. I was a prosecutor, so I'm a recovering lawyer now. I'm a recovering lawyer and a recovering diplomat. And usually, especially when it's the morning, you like to, break the ice a little bit by telling a joke. Normally you tell a lawyer joke because those are, they're always good lawyer jokes. But the problem in my long career I found with lawyer jokes is that lawyers don't think they're funny and non-lawyers don't think they're jokes. So I'll dispense with that today. I'll follow Jeff's lead a little bit and just ask a couple questions to the audience. I mean, how many people think, so Black Hat in Europe, he said, was going on, or Black Hat, I think for 17 years now. How many people think we're better off today than we were 17 years ago? Okay, that's nobody. Not even one person. How many people think that governments really understand this issue and are doing the right things to combat it? Also nobody. Is this working? How many of you think that governments, look at it from both sides, how many think governments are actually consulting the technical community and talking to you guys about some of the problems to inform the policy by really the technical expertise? Okay, a couple hands. That's good. And I think that's better. I think that has gotten better. So what I want to talk to today is about some of the growing threats. I've been doing cyber things for about 27 years now. And so I want to share some of that perspective and also talk about my most recent role in diplomacy in cyberspace and what that means. And I want to talk about how we're combating the threats, but also seizing the opportunities. I also want to explain at some point in the talk what zombies, have to do with this, diplomats, and why I care so much about this. And so let me start there. My old office at the State Department, was I tried to make it unique for a government office. So I had about 30 movie posters of movies where hackers or computers were a main character. And this was my favorite. And of course, not all these are good movies. In fact, many of them are terrible movies. And all of them are dystopian. I don't think there's any positive movie about cyberspace. But they range from The Matrix to War Games to The Computer Who Wore Tennis Shoes. I guess it's a little more positive one. And this one, which is the first movie where computers took over the world. Colossus: The Foreman Project is a 1970 movie that I sat through when I was in grade school, where the U.S. builds Colossus to control its nuclear arsenal, take them out of the middle, and have perfect deterrence. The Soviets steal the information. They build Guardian, their version of the computer, in the Urals. The two computers start talking to each other, become self-aware, and to protect humankind from itself, they take away all civil liberties and take over the world. And that is sort of a metaphor for a lot of things we see in cyberspace today. And it's still a great movie. I don't see it streaming anywhere, but you can still get the disc on Netflix. So that really, I think, helped condition a lot of my thinking about this early on in terms of the threats we were seeing in cyberspace on a nation-state level, but it goes well beyond that too. My first computer back in the day was this. An Atari 800 with a tape drive, cassette tape drive. Since that time, obviously, the industry has advanced tremendously. The opportunities have addressed. I mean, all of you know the great opportunities that cyberspace and computer networks have given us in terms of connectivity and commerce. But you also know that there's been an incredible increase in the threats, by a range of different actors. So in the one sense, it's empowered us. On the other hand, it's allowed criminals and nation states and others to thrive as threat actors, and it's allowed people to be more connected and to organize and do political protests, but it's also allowed states to monitor their citizens and keep a closer eye on it. So the technology itself is not positive or negative, it's just the way it's used. And as I have looked at this, there's almost always been a global or international dimension. And I've been fortunate to have a front row seat and really been driving a lot of these different issues from a policy level. As Jeff said, I was a prosecutor for many years. I went to the mothership first I was in LA, then I went back to the mothership at Justice in DC. Then I went briefly to the FBI, then to the National Security Council at the White House, and then finally at the State Department. What I've seen is that the threats really take two forms. The technical threats that I think everyone in the audience knows very well, and policy threats, which are a little different, but also have a tremendous impact on the future of this technology. To talk a little bit about the threat, and again, this is something I think all of us are living every day. In the front pages of the paper every day, you guys on the front lines are seeing this every day. The Equifax case is a good example. The ransomware and Petya and NotPetya is another good example, which impacted the UK very seriously. And I compare that to what I've seen over the years. For instance, Mitnick was a very serious case back in the late 90s. But it was a very different case. Then it was theft of information from computer systems all over the world. It caused a lot of financial damage, but at the same time, it was very different than some of the kinds of activities we're seeing now. I also was involved in one of the first denial of service attack cases back in the year 2000, which ended up, we traced this back. It took eBay and CNN and other sites offline for a short time. And it was a big deal because people didn't really understand this, as they often don't. And we traced it back to what turned out to be a 14-year-old kid who went by the moniker Mafia Boy in Canada. And we worked with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and put a wiretap on this person's house, not knowing who it was in the house, just knowing it came from this house. And it turned out we picked up the dad issuing a hit on one of his colleagues. So it was a great family. It was Mafia Dad and Mafia Boy. We decided to take it down rather than risk someone getting killed. And then, much later, so that was one of the early denial of service cases, but clearly that threat has evolved in terms of both technical sophistication and some of the activities we've seen there too. The Sony Pictures case was another watershed moment for lots of different reasons. It was a combination of an attempt to keep people from expressing their free speech, whatever you think about that movie. But at the same time, there were physical threats involved. And it resulted and a CEO losing their job, which was a major moment because that means corporations started taking the risk even more seriously. And we had things like the OMB intrusion, which was another major issue. Then we've had other kinds of threats. We've had the wholesale theft of intellectual property by China that really was something that was a big deal and a big sticking point between the US and China, and not just the US, but the UK, Germany, France, and other countries. We also still fear the kind of debilitating attack on infrastructure. This is something we've been talking about for like 15, 20 years. We haven't really seen it. There's been some implications, some indications of this, like in the Ukraine, the power grid attack there, Estonia in 2007, which if you talk to the president, then the president of Estonia, he says it wasn't really as serious as people made it out to be, but clearly it was a watershed too. And we have new technologies on the horizon, like the Internet of Things, which pose even greater technical vulnerabilities, but also I think there are policy dimensions to that too. I have one Internet of Things joke. There was and this is a true case, there were a number of connected refrigerators that were used to launch a denial of service attack against financial institution websites. And I thought that's the newest example yet of freezing your assets. All right. That needs more research and development. And then there are the hybrid threats that we really didn't anticipate. The cyber folks, the cyber community, I don't think really understood the threat that was being posed by Russia, for instance, in trying to undermine democratic processes. And actually, that's a threat. That's a hybrid threat. It's not just a cyber threat, but it's a cyber and political threat. So that's definitely a big deal. And then the policy threats. And the policy threats really involve countries who have a very different vision of the technology going forward. So, they don't just look at the technical threats, but they really view technology itself sometimes as a threat to their stability, and various aspects of technology as a threat that undermines their stability. And so this even translates into the way they talk about these issues. They talk about information security, which is a benign term, but in their sense, it's information security versus cyber security. And what they mean by that is they're trying to control information. They're trying to draw sovereign boundaries around their country and absolutely control information. They're trying to do that because they fear information is going to undermine the stability of their country. And a good example of this, and this is from a hotel room in Beijing I was recently at. They have, as you can see, all these nice logos for all the different internet companies. And if you look at this, and you get this when you get in your hotel room, you go, oh great, I can get all these things. But if you look at the small print, it says, are not available here. so this is the kind of thing that we're seeing increasingly around the world, where countries are trying to restrict the technology, restrict how the technology is used. And they're not trying to just do it in their own country, they're trying to promote that internationally. We have also seen countries that are using the internet to monitor and control their citizens and curtail human rights. So this is the dual nature of the technology. Yes, people can use the technology to communicate, but countries increasingly are using the technology to see what's going on and to actually suppress freedom of expression and assembly. And there's a real battle in the developing world in terms of which of these visions is going to really win out. On the one side, countries want to see economic growth. They're lured by the promise of the technology, but at the same time, they're also worried about stability. And so this is the battle that's going on between countries like the US and many of the countries in Europe and countries that are more repressive and have a very different view of the technology. And that's also playing out in terms of the battles that we're seeing in some of the things that Jeff mentioned, all these different institutions around the world, ICANN, other places like that, where there's an attempt to move the governance of the internet from those technical bodies, where it's always been, driven by technologists, to the UN or to other multi-governmental bodies that don't have the stakeholders like the technical experts, the civil society folks, the industry folks, and be much more state-driven like everything else in history has been. And that is also an attempt to control information. And then we have the fact that over 100 countries, and probably every country, frankly, is developing offensive cyber capabilities and really making cyberspace a new domain of war and the kind of instability that creates. So, I often say, that, in my view, cyber is now the new black. It is everything. Everything. Everyone cares about this. Everyone is all in terms of governments, I think, more than ever before. And what that means is there's an increased emphasis on how we counter that threat, not just nationally, but how we do it internationally. And I want to first make a key observation, and something that I've seen over my career, and that is that it used to be, not too long ago, that if you went into in my country, a cabinet secretary, or in the UK, a minister, or in many other countries, any high-level government official, and you talked about cyber threats, cyber crime, their eyes would roll back in the back of their heads and they'd run screaming from the room. They just didn't want to care about it. They just didn't understand it. They thought it was this really difficult technical thing, and it was hard to get their attention. And that's changed, I think, dramatically, certainly in the US and the UK and many other countries, and I think increasingly in every country, where now these issues are seen as core issues of national security, core issues of economic policy, core issues of human rights policy, and ultimately core issues of foreign policy, which is my most recent gig. And I think that's really important because you have to have the communication between the policy guys and the technical guys to know what the trade space is, to know what you can actually do and accomplish. But at the same time, you can't think of it as just a technical issue that's the province of just the technical experts, because just like in almost every other complex issue out there, you have to think of this as a policy issue. You don't need to be a computer engineer to be a minister who's dealing with this, or a cabinet secretary, and it's important to raise it to that level. And so what that's meant is governments have become more organized around this. I used to say in our government in the US, we had silos of excellence. We had different departments who never talked to each other, had their own policies. Even within departments, they didn't do that. That's changed a lot in the US, which is good. We've done a lot of things. Jeff mentioned a couple of them. We did a cyberspace policy review when President Obama came into office. His campaign had been hacked into, so he was keenly aware of this as an issue, which was important. We did the first international strategy for cyberspace. The UK has now, I think the UK is on its third strategy, its third national strategy, third or fourth. We set up new institutions, which I think is really important. And, in my case, we set up an office at the State Department, which was the first office anywhere in the world devoted to these issues of cyber diplomacy, to really bring it up to the level of talking to other governments around the world about this issue. And we were the first ones. Now there are 25 offices like that and growing. Australia just recently created a cyber ambassador. Virtually every country in Europe now has them. Russia and China and other countries, so both like-minded and non-like-minded countries. And the scope of my old office was very broad. It was everything from cybersecurity issues and cyber crime issues to international security, which I'll get to more in a moment, and preventing cyber conflict and cyber war, internet freedom issues, internet governance issues, and responding to threats using diplomatic tools. And I think it was important to have that very broad suite, because these are not siloed items. And the example I always give is when countries are trying to have states control the internet. They're doing that in an effort to control information, so that has human rights dimensions, and it has security dimensions too. When countries are doing things like indigenous innovation, where they're trying to restrict products, that has security dimensions. So these things are really interrelated, and to look at them in a siloed, separate way is not very helpful. So we've done a number of things to try to advance this area. One, we started all these dialogues. That's what diplomats do. They talk to each other a lot. So we had all these dialogues with countries around the world, including China and Russia, but also all the Nordic Baltic countries, the UK, Brazil, Germany, Korea, Japan, and many more. Israel and many more, as this is becoming more of a policy area. We've created a cadre of cyber diplomats all over the world, which is helpful because, again, it gets people to understand this issue more. And then we've done a number of things to help with operational coordination. We've worked with our law enforcement colleagues to make sure that countries around the world have good cybercrime laws, and many still don't. You may remember many years ago there was the I Love You virus, which was traced to the Philippines, and the guy in the Philippines couldn't do anything about it because their law didn't punish that as a crime at the time. And so you need to have laws that are up to date. You also need to have cooperative mechanisms. We had something called the 24/7 network, which is, it sounds, 24/7 points of contact for high-tech crime, and there are now 64 countries in that network. And I used to do that when I was a justice, and that's helped coordination. We try to get countries around the world to have national CERTs, computer emergency response teams. That wasn't the case, and you need that kind of vehicle, that kind of institution to really help international coordination to deal with these threats. We brought the CERT community and the law enforcement community together. I did this in the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams a number of years ago. And these two communities at first didn't trust each other at all, and now I think they're working together more, which is helpful. And then we've also used diplomatic tools to go after threats. So there was a long-term sustained denial of service attack, botnet, that was going after U.S. financial institutions. And it was later a case that was indicted by our Justice Department involving Iran. But this, and this wasn't the end of the world. It wasn't getting into the backroom trading of these companies. It wasn't changing the integrity of data. But it clearly was something that was a big, as a problem, and a long-term problem. And a nation-state problem. So we looked at various options, and the option that ended up being the most successful is a diplomatic one. I reached out to 20 of my counterparts around the world and did what we call a diplomatic démarche. And before I went to the State Department, démarche just sounds like a bad thing. It sounds like you're yelling at someone. But a démarche could be a good thing. It could be, help me, just help me. I need your help. And if you help me, I'll help you. And so this is what we did. We went to the 20 countries where, and as you know, botnets can shift in their concentration, their focus, but we went to the countries that had the largest concentration, and we said, look, we don't care what tools you use, because you might have different tools in your national tool set. You might be able to talk to the ISPs, you might be able to do other things. We don't care what you use, but help us mitigate this threat. And we want to build a collective group so we can mitigate threats on your behalf too. And so they did. And that was actually a very effective way of not completely neutering that, but really lessening its impact. So I think that was an important story. And that's part of a larger process to build a collection of countries so we can deal with these shared threats, because it's seldom true that one country alone is the focus of a threat. The threats are usually much broader than that. And we have a range of threat actors out there. We have dedicated nation states. We have transnational organized crime. We have lone gunman hackers, as I used to call them, that still exist. We have terrorists, although frankly, what we've seen is terrorists mostly using the internet to communicate and to plan and not actually attacking infrastructures, but we're worried about that too. So we have a range. Our Director of National Intelligence for several years has talked about the nation-state threats and says that Russia, China are the most sophisticated, but Iran and North Korea are gaining sophistication and are also real threats. And there are other countries and other types of threats out there. So we have this range of threats. And to build that kind of coordination against those threats is important. We've also done what diplomats typically do, which is negotiation. So I talked about the long-term threat that we face from Chinese theft of intellectual property. And that, people describe that in various ways, but this is sort of a slow bleed. So, you're losing the life's blood of the future of a lot of your economic growth and your companies. And so it's a really serious thing. And we had sustained pressure, President Obama and almost everyone else, sustained pressure saying this is such a big deal. This wasn't just a cyber deal. This was something that was going to have an effect on the overall relationship. And that really made a huge difference. And after 2.5 years, and we did some things like indicted 5 of the PLA actors, there was a threat of economic sanctions. And just before President Xi came to DC, there was a very flurried attempt to negotiate, and I was part of that, where we reached an agreement with the Chinese that countries should not use cyber means to steal the trade secrets and intellectual property of other countries and to then benefit their own commercial sector. Now, I wasn't born yesterday. I don't think that there's going to be complete compliance with that, but that really did change the game. And then the UK reached a similar agreement, the G20 reached a similar agreement, Germany, Australia with China. So it created a global norm that this is what acceptable behavior is. And I think it's important to start setting what some of those rules are. We also have engaged, especially with the developing world, in a lot of capacity building, especially with sub-Saharan Africa and the Latin American countries and the ASEAN countries, because countries are beginning to grapple, even developing world countries are beginning to grapple with these issues as they're getting new connectivity, and it's better to start thinking about these issues now. So we've been doing a mix of cybercrime, cybersecurity, human rights, regional trainings that we've done for many years, and I think that's been helpful. So those are the kind of things that we've done to kind of react to some of the threats on a real-time basis, but then we've also tried to shape the environment going forward. And what we tried to come up with, and this is one thing my former office really was leading on, was this idea of how do you prevent cyber conflicts. So you prevent cybercrime by going after them with law enforcement tools. You prevent, incidents by having good incident response and making sure you have international cooperation. But in the long term, with all these countries developing cyber capabilities, how can you help shape the environment so it's a more stable environment to make sure that the great things about cyberspace are not undermined by the instability of uncertainty? And the framework we advanced had three prongs. One, international law applies in cyberspace, just like it does in the physical world. Now, what that means, we're still working out, but it's not this lawless space where anything goes. International law applies. That means things like if you actually did have cyber warfare, there are things like distinction and proportionalities, rules that govern the physical world that govern the cyber world. And that was really important. And we got a number of countries, including China and Russia, to agree to that a number of years ago, and that was a landmark point. The second part of the stability framework was norms. Not this norm, but it's the old picture, but these norms. And so, international law applies to the very high level acts of cyber warfare, which frankly we hardly ever see. But there's a lot of activity that happens that you guys all know that's below that threshold. So how can you set some rules of the road for nation states that will govern all this space that's below that very high threshold, below an act of war? And so what we've been advancing is some of these norms. One, that states should not, in peacetime, states should not attack the critical infrastructure of another state that provides services to the public. Two, that states shouldn't go after the CERTs, the Computer Emergency Response Teams, or the CSERTs. It's like going after the ambulances on a battlefield, that is disruptive. And that CERTs should be used for defensive purposes and not offensive purposes. And three, that there is a expectation of cooperation. If you see malicious code coming from your country and another country asks you, you'll use law enforcement or technical means to help mitigate that. And we got pretty wide agreement so far within a smaller group of countries in the UN on this, but it's something we're trying to advance internationally. And Jeff mentioned that we're part of this Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace, and we came up with another more defined norm on that first set where we talk about the not attacking critical infrastructure of protecting the core of the internet, the core routers and other things, the domain name service that actually makes the internet run. That's something that we think is a public good, and if we actually attack that in peacetime, if countries do that, that will destabilize the whole system. So this was an important way of saying, of trying to set some rules of the road to start putting some boundaries around cyberspace and what's acceptable conduct. And they're norms of restraint, which means, when we propose these, we say we won't do these. But there are also norms of cooperation, like the one that is the cooperation against shared threats. So that's been good, and we need to get more countries to adopt this. We need to get more countries to actually embrace this framework and agree to these norms, because you can't really have progress if only a few countries agree to them. You have to have really more or less universal acceptance. So that's one of our big efforts right now. What I think we have not done a very good job at is deterrence in cyberspace. And this is when you think about what the rules of the road are, you have rules of the road so that if people violate the rules of the road, you take action, right? So just like in anything in the physical world, you have rules. Rules are kind of worthless if there's no action taken when people violate them. So, I think by inaction, if you don't take any action at all, you create essentially a norm that activity is okay. So if we don't react to some of the major issues we're seeing by nation states or criminals or others, then you're basically saying that's okay. So it's like, if you have good computer security, you're locking the doors, which is great, but if there's no enforcement, there's no way to go after the bad actors, they're going to keep trying to do it. So you need, on the criminal side, you need good criminal enforcement and you need good security. But that's true with nation-state threats too. You need to make sure there are consequences for bad actions. And so I don't think that's been something we've been very good at, because the core part of deterrence, there's deterrence by denial, which is building up your defenses, which is important. We should always do that. But there's also deterrence by having credible and timely response. And I would say that our credibility, the kind of actual responses we've done, have been okay, but not as good as they could be. And timeliness is a real problem. And timeliness is a problem in part because of attribution. I don't think attribution, however, is impossible. I think attribution is increasingly, it's not easy. There are complications, to be sure. But if you have a long-term, if you have a single incident, it's harder to attribute. If you have a more long-term incident, it's easier to attribute. And you just don't look at the digital footprints. You also look at, your whatever other intelligence you might have. You look at money flows, if it's a criminal group. You look at motive. And attribution, at the end of the day, is a political issue. It's a technical issue, to be sure, but it's not. You never have 100% attribution. And when I was a prosecutor, you prosecuted under a standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, which is not absolute proof, but it was beyond a reasonable doubt. For attribution, at the end of the day, when a country decides to accuse another actor of doing this, it is a political decision. And there are some countries who are bad actors who say, we need 100% attribution. Not surprised why they want that, because they don't want to ever be blamed for things. But that's not really the standard. And so we have to be able to get to attribution quicker so we can take action quicker so we can have this deterrent effect. The other thing I think we need to do is start working with other countries so it's not just a single country striking back against a bad actor. And I'll give you an example. When North Korea did the Sony Pictures attack, everyone said it was North Korea. Everyone in the press, all the technical community said it's North Korea. Until President Obama came out and said it's North Korea. Then we had a lot of people saying, it's not North Korea. They're wrong. And they said that because we didn't release all the information. But you have to understand, governments will never release all the information they have. They're not going to release sensitive intelligence. They're going to release some of the, and in that case, I think we went beyond what we normally do. We sent out a lot of things, from the criminal investigation about what we knew. But at the end of the day, we knew. But there were a lot of people saying, no, that's not them, now that you accused them of it. And so we have to get beyond that issue, because attribution is important, but making sure there are consequences for these bad actors. And in that case, we did sanctions and other things are important. The other problem we have, I think, is we have one thing is building alliances, countries who can act together collectively against bad actors. And it's sort of like there's money laundering is a good predicate, where some countries turned a blind eye to it, but then you got the global community to come together voluntarily, and over time it became much harder to do that. There's something called the Proliferation Security Initiative for fissile material, nuclear material, which is a voluntary group of countries who can act in small groups to deal with transgressors. I see that as the future in cyberspace. And the other thing we need to do is we need to have better tools. And this is where I think a lot of you guys come in too. So right now, our tool set is pretty limited. We have diplomatic tools. We can, do the diplomatic pressure like we did with China. We have law enforcement tools. You can indict people. If it's a nation state, probably not all that effective, but it maybe sends a message. But if they're never going to travel, I'm not sure really where that gets you. You have sanctions, economic sanctions. We have a cyber sanctions order in the U.S. We haven't used it that often, so that's something maybe we could use more. We have other economic tools. We have the much touted, but I think highly overrated cyber tools. People think there's a cyber red button you press and you can launch these cyber tools and it's going to really dissuade other people. It's much, much more complicated than that. And I think much more difficult than that to have a real sustained effect. So I think that's really, not the silver bullet. And then you have kinetic tools, and I can't imagine launching a missile to respond to a cyber attack unless it's the kind of cyber attack that causes death and bodily injury like an actual attack. So the tool set's really pretty limited. So what that means to me is that we have to expand the tool set. We have to work, particularly with the technical community, to say, what's the option space? What are things we haven't thought of? I mean, people have said, can you black hole traffic for countries? Are there technical things you can do that will hold a bad actor at risk, so that it causes them pain, and you can say, okay, this is temporary and reversible. If you change your actions, we can remove it. And we can do that as part of a global community. So I do think there's a lot of room there for people to work together. And then we also have to deal with as I said, the hybrid threats before. So we have to think outside the box and see what other threats are out there. As I said, we didn't see the Russia threat coming on trying to undermine democratic processes. There are probably other ones we don't see coming too. And this is, again, where I think the policy people benefit from the technical community telling them what the threats are that are out there and how we can deal with them. I think ultimately diplomacy ends up playing a big role in this because, again, almost all these things are international. And it requires, I think, the kind of high-level policy discussions between governments, but also conversations with the technical community and other people who are on the front lines. And it really has to be something where we're working together. I talked about, in the beginning, the movie Colossus. And this is the actual Colossus. In the movie Colossus took over the world and enslaved mankind. The actual Colossus was the first digital programmable electronic computer. And this is from Bletchley Park. If you've never been to Bletchley Park, you should all go to Bletchley Park. It's a great thing. You can see how the Enigma code was broken. This was used to break something called the Lorenz code, which was Hitler's high-level code during World War II. So in this sense, Colossus was used to save the world, not to enslave it. And I think that's really the future of the technology we want. And I'll end with another joke, which is that this was a lawyer joke, but I've changed it to a hacker joke. So a hacker is walking down the beach, finds a lamp, rubs it. Predictably enough, a genie comes out. And the genie says, look, you get 3 wishes, but because you're a hacker, there's some strings attached. And the hacker says, okay, fine. And the genie says, the strings are everything you wish for, every other hacker gets twice as much of. And the hacker says, okay, I can deal with that. And so the genie says, what's your first wish? And the hacker says, well, I want a million bitcoins. So he gets the bitcoins and credit cards, 10,000 credit cards and bitcoins. So he gets that, but every other hacker gets 20,000 and twice as much as he did. And again, this just irks him because he's a competitive guy. And so the genie says, what do you want? He goes, well, I want, this is a while ago, so he wanted a Cray supercomputer. So he got that, but every other hacker got that and Watson by IBM. And again, this kind of really pissed him off. And the genie says, hurry up, what's your third wish? I want to get back in the bottle and watch I Dream of Jeannie reruns. What do you want? And the hacker pauses and he thinks about it and says, I'd like to donate a kidney. So the theme of the story, and this has been borne out in my career, the theme of that story is both the technical and policy threats we're seeing to this technology are going to continue. Jeff asked, are things getting more complex? They're getting more complex. And the people who attack and try to get into these systems and cause havoc, both the range of threat actors and their sophistication has also gotten, I think, much more sophisticated. And that means that governments really have to pay attention to this and do a good job, a better job than they're doing, and they also have to work closely with you folks in the technical community to make sure that we're doing this. So that, I'm going to stop there and open it up to questions and answers. So please. I think there are microphones circulating somewhere.
Thank you, Chris. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, so hi, I'm Phil from CyberX. Thank you for a great presentation this morning. I want to ask about critical infrastructure. We know there's been the 2 attacks on the Ukrainian grid. We saw what NotPetya did to some of our manufacturing infrastructure this summer. And the DHS reported in 2014 that there was black energy malware in our critical infrastructure. No destructive attacks, but we assume cyber espionage type stuff. What have we done or tried to do or should do to deter that kind of activity? Well,
it's a good question. It goes to my last point that, there are, first of all, it's sometimes difficult to see when things are there for espionage, which every country in the world does. or if you're actually launching a destructive attack. And obviously, that's much more serious. We need to, we don't have to accept either. Even though espionage happens all over the world, doesn't mean we have to say that's okay. We need to react to it. And when we see that kind of malware, that even if it's dual purpose and can be used for that case, and it's particularly if it's in very critical infrastructure, if it's in nuclear control systems or things like that, we have to take that very seriously. And if we know who the actor is, we have to use all the tools I talked about to try to get them to change their ways. So I think that's something we do need to get better at, because I think that, we've talked about this cyber, people have talked about cyber Armageddon and cyber 9/11s and cyber Pearl Harbors for years now. And we haven't seen it, which is good. And part of the reason for that is countries are interconnected, and there's lots of reasons we haven't seen that. But those kind of threats are real, and I think we need to do a much better job of deterring that.
Thank you. Do you have any thoughts on NotPetya and attribution there?
No, not beyond what's in the press on that, but I think that clearly it was certainly an interesting case because it had minor effects in the U.S. It had much more major effects in certain countries because of patching and other issues. But it certainly illustrates how fragile a lot of our systems are if they're not actually taken care of, and what kind of impact something like that can have, which again means we just have to be more serious about it.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
Hello. Good morning, Chris. I'm Dirk from Germany, and you've talked a lot about government policy. My question is, looking at past and present efforts of US entities to undermine or impede the availability of strong cryptography, do you think this is a policy worth following? Will this help us? So what I'm referring to, for example, the crypto wars in the 90s, the NSA-driven NIST standards for pseudo number generations that led to weak cryptography keys, or the current Californian law initiative to ban disk encryption. So do you think this is a policy worth following? Will this make us safer?
So this is a really hard debate, and I was involved in this debate in the government. And look, if I had the answer to this, and this is not just a debate in the U.S., it's clearly a debate that's happening in the U.K., it's happening in France, it's happening around the world. And, the problem is, when I was in law enforcement, I would have loved the idea of a fully attributable internet. I think that's a terrible idea now for lots of reasons. So for human rights reasons, for regimes who repress their citizens. So you have to have this balance. And so encryption obviously protects privacy. It also is good for security, as I think almost everyone in the audience knows. But at the same time, you can certainly understand that if there is a terrorist attack or a serious criminal attack, that if law enforcement can't get access to the data at all, that's very difficult. I'd also say there's a difference between device encryption, which has gotten a lot of attention, which is an easier problem to solve, but still difficult because it would require a lot of steps to jump through to still protect privacy and do it in the right way, and encryption in transit, which is almost impossible as far as I can tell. So, so you have this rock against a hard place sort of situation, and I don't believe. I believe encryption's good. I think it's a good thing. But at the same time, I understand why there's a compelling need to get this. I don't think it's through building backdoors. I think that's somehow that even that language, I think, is emotionalized the discussion a lot. I think there are ways for governments and the private sector to talk about this. It's like the crypto wars back in the 80s, when I was part of those too, when I remember there was an attempt to try to restrict the export of encryption technology from the US, which people understood was a fool's errand after a while, because that's not the only place encryption tools are made, for instance. And so it's a really, really difficult problem, and I wish I knew the solution, but maybe people in the audience can help with this, because I do think there are two compelling needs there, and both of them have really strong arguments. I just don't know the solution. But I do still think encryption is a good thing.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for an insightful talk. My name is Alex, and you mentioned that over the recent years, collaboration between different agencies in the US has improved. Yeah. Could you elaborate a bit more, in particular on the various agencies and departments that have been created in the post-9/11 era, and how has information sharing improved? Are there any policies that are still hampering information sharing, and what are the consequences of that?
So there are two things. One, there's information sharing between the government and the private sector, which is better but not perfect. I mean, so in that area, first there was something, companies were concerned about sharing information with the government because they were worried about trade secrets, and so there was a special Freedom of Information Act exemption made. They still weren't sharing the information because they were worried about liability. Then the Department of Justice issued a letter saying, there's no antitrust liability if you share it for this purpose. They still didn't share the information because they were worried about liability. Then there was a law that was passed in our Congress a couple years ago granting limited liability protection. And I think that information flow is better, but I think a fair thing I hear from industry all the time is that the information sharing between government and industry actually has to be actionable. So just getting a bunch of things from the government or from industry that are just kind of pablum is not helpful. You really have to do something that's actionable, and I think that's important. As far as between government, I think there's been a real improvement. It used to be, like I said, people really weren't talking to each other. We got, in 2010, about 16 agencies into a room to write this international strategy, and it was creative cacophony. So the economic agencies were talking about internet policy, the security agencies were talking about cyber policy. They didn't even talk the same language or have the same goals. But just the process of writing that over a number of years, or over a year and a half, I think helped bring them together. And as much as I hate meetings, the kind of meetings that were held at the White House, which I helped run when I was there and participated when I left, and the meetings I held at the State Department of all the different agencies, I think were helpful in getting people, even if the agencies didn't agree. I used to have a call every 2 weeks with my DOD counterpart. We didn't always agree on everything, but at least we knew where each other's were and what we were doing. And I think that really helps. And I've seen that in the UK and other countries too. When you have national strategies around this, building that organizational structure so there's better communication is key, because no one agency in the government is going to have the whole ticket on this.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about the slide you had about peacetime norms, and it strikes me there are a lot of parallels with that and game theory, prisoner's dilemma. So a lot of those points would play to credibility, mutual trust across a number of nations. How do you contrast that with organizations such as the Tower Group and other countries that have similar groups?
If the idea is to build better mutual trust, that's getting more countries to kind of sign on to these things, but there's still a trust issue. So the third leg of the framework that I mentioned, that I didn't really go into detail on, is something called confidence building measures. So this is the parallel to this is the only real parallel to the nuclear world. And people try to draw parallels from cyber to nuclear. There aren't many. There are no launch plumes in cyber. There's lots of differences. But the one parallel is that in the nuclear world, we got a long way with our frenemies and enemies by having confidence building measures, sharing doctrine, having points of contact, having hotlines that we set up for that. And so we're trying to do that for cyber too, to build that better trust and understanding between countries. So the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is 57 countries, I think, has now 16 of these confidence building measures that they've been promulgating and getting countries to share. I think we need to do more of that because that's practical. So this is policy, which you want to aspire to. You want people to adopt these. But at the same time, you want to have the channels of communication. So when you see an event and you think a country is responsible, there's a way of reaching out and saying what's going on here. And so that's an important part of it. And that's the third part of that framework, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
I'd also say, and when I mentioned the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Initiative, that was another example where countries voluntarily came together in small groups. You didn't have everyone in the beginning, but you had smaller groups and it built from that. And so that's another way to approach it.
Hi, my name is Greg. Does this on?
I don't know.
You talk about consequence, and how do you couch that in a situation where in situations like the PLA5, when they were indicted, immediately we started seeing less talented actors working from the same source. So what it seemed to be happening was that the government was having those that were indicted teach new people as the old ones were being handed over.
Yeah, I think I think the indictments probably served more as a message and might have helped condition the agreement 2 years later with the Chinese. I don't think it actually had an effect in stopping the activity, and I think you're right about that. I think there was, the way you stop the activity is you get a high-level agreement with the government to stop it and make sure there are consequences if they violate that. So we didn't take anything off the table. We didn't take sanctions. We didn't take indictments. We didn't take diplomatic or other pressure off the table when the agreement happened, because we said, look, we want to see if you're actually abiding by this. But I think that's true. When the indictments happen, two things happened. First, the Chinese canceled the diplomatic, we had a diplomatic working group on cyber between us and the Chinese. We have it again now. But they canceled that, which seemed a little odd, because that was a channel of communication. And the other thing is, I don't think the activity really substantially decreased. The difference, I think, and look, this is an ongoing process. The difference after we reached the agreement a couple of years ago is a lot of the public reporting on that has seen a diminution in that kind of activity. It doesn't mean all the activity has ceased, because espionage and other things still happen, but that kind of commercial activity. So, yeah, I think there's a limit to using law enforcement tools when you're dealing with nation states. Okay, all right, thanks.